Good morning, afternoon, or evening to everyone. My name is Frank Place, and I am the Director of the Policies, Institutions, and Markets CGIAR Research Program. I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar on methods for studying gender dynamics in value chains beyond the production node and single commodity analysis. This is the second and final webinar in the series on gender dynamics in value chains. The first one focused on findings and was presented on September 21st, and this will focus on methods. These collaborative studies were the last of 3 funded by the CGIAR Collaborative Platform for Gender Research while it was hosted under PIM. Gender Dynamics in Seed Systems and Feminization of Agriculture were the other 2. This one on value chains mirrors the interest of the 2030 CGIAR Research and Innovation Strategy to support food systems beyond food production, to provide jobs and income for the poor and marginalized.
Doing sales, you're not necessarily
and more environmentally sustainable outcomes. So let me introduce the moderator for
to
opening remarks and then introduce the other speakers and the program. Rhiannon Pyburn,
Great.
CGIAR Partnership Senior Expert and Senior Advisor
to decide where to uses it in its fullness.
Sometimes refer to it. She was the coordinator of the gender platform
Of an enterprise.
Leads the PIM cluster where that work is being completed.
enterprises, even, for.
Let me mention how our webinar will work.
Actually.
At the end of the program, after all of the 3 speakers are finished. Throughout the 3 presentations, I encourage you to type in your questions in the chat window on the right side of your screen. Please type in your name and organization along with your question. We will compile them and try to organize them by theme before posing them to the speakers if there are many questions. Finally, we are recording the webinar and will make it available on the PIM website shortly after the event. So with that, over to you, Rhiannon.
Great, thanks so much, Frank. So indeed, the projects that are being presented today are 3 of 6 that were supported through this work on gender and value chains. The initiative for these 6 projects, it was started up to look at what we saw as a gap in the gender and value chains research that had been done to date. So the work that we were seeing was heavily focused on specific commodity chains and really at the production level. So these projects are meant to address that gap by looking at gender dynamics in value chains beyond the production level and or across multiple chains. So the different projects you'll be hearing from this morning, afternoon, evening are addressing different elements of that. As Frank mentioned, today we're going to focus first and foremost on methods, the methods used to explore gender dynamics beyond production level and across multiple chains. We want to put a spotlight on methods because a lot of different methods and tools are being used, and so we thought this really merits some further discussion and some sharing also more publicly. Of course, in order to share the methods, the presenters will also be sharing some context and background about the project overall and some of the research findings. So we're going to hear from 3 of those projects today. The first is on understanding the relationship between women's empowerment and women's increased participation in the poultry value chain or poultry value chains in Burkina Faso. Jessica Leight, who is based at the International Food Policy Research Institute, will be presenting that work. The second presentation is entitled From Oil Palm Mamas to Market Queens, Measuring the Gender Footprint of Informal and Formal Market Chains in Eastern Region Ghana. And Emily Gallagher from the Center for International Forestry Research will be presenting today. We also may hear from a colleague of hers during the question and answer period. And the third presentation on agricultural value chain financing for marginalized women, a multi-value chain project in Vietnam and Indonesia, will be presented by Kate Ambler, also from the International Food Policy Research Institute. As Frank mentioned, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat, and we will come back to them at the end of the after the presentations. So thanks very much, and with that, I will pass over to Jessica. Jessica, it's all yours.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, Frank and Rhiannon. I'm happy today to be presenting evidence around the pathways linking salivary participation and women's increased participation in poultry chains in Burkina Faso. And this is joint work with a number of colleagues, Jessica Heckert, Alo Gelly, and Joshua Awanan, all at IFPRI. Joshua recently moved to Tufts, and Dr. Rasmane Ganaba, who's at Afrique Santé in Burkina Faso. The research question that motivates this paper is to analyze the relative contributions of multiple dimensions of a program called CIFOR implemented in Burkina Faso with the objective of enhancing women's participation in poultry production and their decision-making around production and consumption of poultry-related projects. And CIFOR as a program had many dimensions. Women were engaged in producer groups. There was training offered around both poultry husbandry and business-related questions. And there was also interaction with village vaccination volunteers and trainings around nutrition and gender. We're interested in understanding the contribution of each of these program dimensions to women's ownership, revenue, and profits in the poultry value chain. So why are we interested in this question? Many integrated value chain interventions that target participation by women in agricultural production include many program elements that are rolled out simultaneously. Some might be at the community level, some at the household level, some might target women directly, some might target men or other stakeholders. But we don't know as much about the relative effectiveness of these different components. Identifying and prioritizing the most effective elements and understanding how they interact with one another can have meaningful implications for implementation and also cost effectiveness. So what are the methods that we're using in this analysis? Now, the broader project is a randomized controlled trial. So we have communities that were randomly assigned to receive CIFOR activities for households to participate in, and some communities in which those activities weren't rolled out for the duration of this project. Here, we're moving beyond the randomized trial and the comparison across treatment and control communities to conduct some causal mediation analysis drawing on structural equation modeling with the objective of unpacking the role of these different components. And I'll be kind of discussing the intuition behind that method. Causal mediation is a well-established method. It's widely used in cross-sectional and longitudinal analysis, but within RCT designs, it's a relatively newer innovation. And in the context of an RCT, the goal of the method is to test the plausibility of potential impact pathways. So we're focusing on outcomes where we saw program impacts in the first step, and then trying to unpack what the pathways were for those effects. This is relatively novel in the literature. Let me tell you a bit more about the underlying evaluation and the findings. There's much more to say, but time is short. As I briefly noted, it's a cluster randomized trial, included 120 villages in rural Burkina Faso. They were randomly assigned to be included in CIFOR programming or to serve as the control group. And tracking households over time, we saw that for women in communities where CIFOR was offered, there was a significant increase in the number of poultry owned and in revenue and profits from poultry reported by women. So that's kind of the underlying pattern that we're seeking to unpack here. But how does causal mediation work? So on the left of the slide, you can see the overall program impact without mediation that I just described. So we know that the program resulted in an increase in ownership of poultry and revenue and profits for women. On the right-hand side, we can visually depict the mediation analysis. So in addition to the program and the outcome, we now have mediators that are kind of the third box. And what SEM allows us to do is unpack the overall effect into these different paths. So there's an indirect effect via the mediator, which is A times B. There's a direct effect, that's C prime, and the total effect is the sum of the two. And how do we estimate these paths? We do this using regression analysis with kind of particular set of structural assumptions, regressing the mediator on the independent variable. In our case, that's just the treatment. So did you receive CIFOR or not? That allows us to estimate the value of path A. And then we use the outcome variable and regress it on the mediator to estimate B and C prime. So we can take this diagram and then populate it with estimates that allow us to understand the relative importance of each mediator. And again, from an intuitive perspective, and what's our goal, we want to understand what is the indirect effect of CIFOR that's mediated by program participation. Now, program participation is modeled using observable variables. That's just whether the household reports that they participated in the dimensions of interest. That's poultry, nutrition, and gender are our 3 dimensions. And then there's a direct effect that's unmediated by participation. How do we think about that? I mean, that could reflect a range of other factors. It could be community level spillovers. So you didn't participate yourself, but you learned from neighbors. It could be market level effects. There were shifts in supply or demand. And it could be shifting attitudes or norms around women's engagement in poultry that you absorbed or heard about from neighbors. So the decomposing these two parts, the indirect effect and the direct effect, helps us understand for a program like CIFOR that has many components and participation is voluntary, how much of the effect is driven by those who do actually participate, who choose to attend, and how much is driven by other effects in the community that might reach even those who chose not to attend or were not able to. And again, since this is a randomized design, we're confident that the direct effect doesn't reflect other differences in observable or unobservable characteristics comparing across the communities. So we know that on average, the treatment and control communities were the same. So here is a slightly more complex diagram that breaks down how we're analyzing this question. So again, you can see the 3 core components are the treatment variable on the left, the outcome variables on the right. Here we've highlighted poultry owned by women and revenue. And on the top is our measure of poultry participation, which is modeled as a latent variable. And the specific variables at the top are the variables that households reported on. So that they informed us whether they were members of a producers group, whether they participated in poultry training, whether they participated in business training. Of course, there could be some inaccuracies there, but those are the underlying reports that we used. And just to briefly preview the results, using this method, we conclude that about 50% of the total effect of CIFOR on poultry owned by women is mediated by program participation. So that's actually lower than we thought. We had expected that to be higher, and that suggests that the remaining share is attributable to other program components, to interactions among the components, to spillover effects as we described, and we're continuing to explore this. So this methodology is allowing us to illuminate how the intervention is shifting households' outcomes, and in particular, how important some of the indirect channels beyond direct program participation seem to be in this context. Thank you very much. I will wrap up my part there and pass it off to Emily Gallagher.
Thank you, Jessica, and good afternoon, and thank you to Rhiannon for facilitating us today. My name is Emily Gallagher. I'm a scientist with the Value Chains Finance and Investment team at CIFOR. The co-contributors are listed here, including Lydia Gatteri, who is joining us today for the Q&A. The talk is titled From Oil Palm Mamas to Market Queens, with a focus today on presenting our steps towards developing gender footprinting methodology. So I'll begin with the conceptual framework, project background, research design, and methodology. And actually the results have been removed for brevity, but I'm happy to discuss, and then we'll close with applications. So our idea for gender footprinting comes out of this larger body of literature on environmental and social footprinting, founded in human rights-based principles and sustainable development goals, and maturing into full life cycle assessments to analyze environmental, economic, and social impacts of either the product system or the organization system. But sometimes, in fact, most times, we are interested in only a portion of the product life cycle. So a social footprint analysis, therefore, is a measure of a social sustainability performance of a company, an organization, or a set of value chain actors in the production of a commodity. It is often described as a company or commodity footprint leaving a mark on Earth or on communities. It allows us to compare the effects of a product or organization system within a sector, or compare the relative size of a changing footprint over time. So social footprint analysis, and this is important, describes both positive and negative impacts, positive being social opportunities and negative being social risks. More recently, the language is shifting such that footprint implies a negative imprint on the earth or communities, and a handprint is to describe the positive impacts, giving more agency to positive outcomes. Next slide, please. So social footprints basically represent a measurement on specific indicators or composite indicators. They imply a spatial component, but this is less often the case with social data presented as a set of metrics or graphs. There is no common guideline, but there are several standards, which I'll get to. And with respect to gender, indicators are largely limited to metrics for equal opportunities, non-discrimination, following sustainability standards models. Importantly, there are global coordinated efforts that are increasingly relying on global data sets from the global market, from the global trade model, for example, and ongoing push-pull between those who advocate for enterprise-level analysis and those seeking online models. So our project aims to contribute to these communities of practice working at the organizational system or enterprise levels to specifically bring a gender dimension and gender disaggregated approach to social footprinting. So if we could move to slide 5. We developed and piloted a diagnostic tool to support enterprise development with respect to ethical sourcing and decent work environments and gender empowerment, equity, and inclusion, as well as intersectoral development planning. Slide 6. So the product of interest is palm oil. The process system is oil palm, or the palm oil value chain. Our project is based in Ghana, where oil palm is indigenous, and palm oil is a major part of the Ghanaian diet. Very briefly, the oil palm oil economy in Ghana has a highly organized formal sector with large estates, factories, mills, and contract farming schemes. And it also still maintains this vibrant, informal, milling sector, which has only grown with the growth of the companies. So the formal and informal sectors are selling to different buyers, but they are competing for raw materials. And this has placed the producers in an enviable situation where they can shop for services, incentives from different mills, and where we can impact that different value chains and business models have on value chain actors. Slide 7. To the title of our presentation, we chose the oil palm oil value chain to test our approach because it is highly gendered value chain. The production node has traditionally been in the domain of men, and the midstream value chain nodes in the domain of women as farm gate buyers, artisanal millers, and processors. Value chain upgrading with capital assets has led to more control by men at the midstream nodes. It means the strong empowerment discourse around women's roles as oil palm mamas and market queens, while the king oil comes from the estate farms. Slide 8. Our research questions center around our methodology to conduct a gender value chain analysis and design an approach to gender footprinting. Next slide. The first step is to determine our area of protection and the extent of our footprint analysis. The footprint is centered on the miller processor node and examines the upstream and downstream effects of participation with different types of millers. Slide 10. Our study area is in one district in the eastern region of Ghana. The district is dominated by oil palm compared to the surrounding districts with traditional cocoa systems. Slide 11. So the methodology includes 7 steps, which I will introduce one by one. Slide 12. The first step is a gender value chain analysis, which included market surveys to map the prevalence and consumer prices at different palm oil products across the district, key informant interviews with companies, artisanal millers, research institutes, and district agriculture offices, and in 750 household surveys across the district to map the distribution of different types of value chain actors and the products they are producing. So we're skipping the results here and moving on to slide 13. The second step involved a literature review to select our indicators. We narrowed down the selection of these global initiatives, which have involved significant participation from social life cycle assessment scholars and practitioners, as well as the corporate sector. So we have included social life cycle assessment to select a set of impact categories. This comes from UNEP CTAC. We compared this to the Global Resources Inventory Standards, which comes from the private sector for social and environmental disclosures, and then sustainability standards really focused on fair trade, for which CIFOR has already conducted a review of their gender strategy. We also included the Women's Empowerment Agriculture Index for Market Inclusion. Sorry, typo there. And then we pulled together the key informant interviews and asked the stakeholders to rank the relevant salience of these impact categories to their business function. And then from this, we made our final selection. Slide 14 shows our impact categories, which include both material and empirical questions, as well as the perception-based questions. We addressed these to different stakeholder categories. The main stakeholder categories included workers of mills and farmers sourcing to these mills. Next slide. Then we added an intra-household module, which we appended to the main survey for workers and farmers, and added the stakeholder category of spouse, domestic partner, or opposite same-sex counterpart from the same household to study the household level effects. Slide 16. The third step was to select our case studies. We had 3 formal sector palm oil millers and 3 informal sector. For the formal sector, the 3 active companies in the district had very different business models. For the informal sector, we categorized the artisanal mills from the key informant interviews into 3 groups and selected a representative model of each. Next slide. The fourth step was to conduct an enterprise interview with the management or owners of the 6 case study mills. These were largely trying to understand how each enterprise is organized from within. We did not try to map out the entire business model due to the company concerns about sharing details. We then tagged who does which job by male, female, age, class, etc. And then asked questions which mirror the main impact categories, asking the managers, owners about the business practices and social risk categories. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip slides 18 and 19. Let's go to 20. The fifth step was the survey administration. Entering from the miller processor. With the companies, we had their opportunity structure and the list of their labor roles. We requested a list of men and women engaged in these roles and did a sub-selection from those lists. We repeated the same for farmers. With the artisanal mills, we interviewed all of the processors and all of the direct hires. We also interviewed casual workers and farmers that were working with each of the oil palm mamas, the processors. So at this stage, we are currently analyzing the data on each impact category, subcategory, and indicator to decide how to use it in the subsequent analysis. Next slide. The sixth step of our protocol is a validation and gender workshop. We invited 8 to 10 participants from each survey to participate in focus groups. We presented them with the opportunity structure, the survey results, asked for validation, and facilitated discussion on the gender dynamics. Then we more explicitly transitioned to discussing gender norms, opportunities, and risks associated with different labor roles. We used the gender labor bar, which you see here, to probe for male, female dominant roles or shared roles, and then how these roles have changed over time. Finally, we close with a discussion about why the worker has chosen this mill over the dozens of choices in the district. Next slide, 22. The final step is to conduct a hotspot analysis, and this is where we are working out our methodology at the moment. The social life cycle assessment community has a social hotspot database led by a research team in New York. They use an approach for set threshold categories for social risks based on global data and conducting a hotspot analysis on the threshold categories. We are aiming to use an approach common to ArcGIS and other spatial analyst tools, the GEDIS or DGI star, which identifies clusters of high values or hot spots and low values, which are cold spots, without setting a threshold. Whether these clusters are more pronounced than expected from a random distribution and statistically significant. We're at the stage of analyzing the data on each indicator, descriptive stats, and then set up our protocol for the spatial hotspots. Finally, moving to slide 23. So once we've developed this protocol, what are we doing with it? As part of a larger project, we have launched an oil palm working group where we will share the outputs from the study, the enterprise reports, maps, and outcomes from the hotspot analysis. From there, we aim to do a review of the impact categories, subcategories, and indicators to develop a more parsimonious tool and whether or how to set thresholds, how to scale the analysis to other enterprises or value chains. The results of the study then will be integrated into an oil palm development strategy for the district, which is to be presented next year. So with that, let me close and thank you and welcome your questions.
Thanks, Emily. So I'll be talking about a project on agricultural value chain financing for marginalized women. Next slide, please. So this project has a long history. It was a large project which we designed to study financial access in the value chain in 2 countries, Vietnam and Indonesia, with a focus on marginalized women. So the idea of this project was to do a lot of desk work and in-country work on policies to understand needs, and then to design and implement the evaluation of a couple randomized control trials studying the impacts of financing programs. Given the global events over the last couple years, some of that portion has been delayed, and so we expect those impact studies to be going into the field at the end of this year and next year. So in the meantime, our current focus has been learning from existing data. So I think ideally I would have been talking to you about impact evaluation methods, but instead I'm going to talk a little bit about what we can do to get the most out of existing data on these topics. And it's been a really instructive exercise to inform what we need to still learn and how we can change the surveys that we do. Next slide, please. So as part of this exercise, we looked at 3 sources of data to study the financial constraints affecting micro, small, and medium enterprises in the agri-food system, with a focus on gender differentiation. And so I'm talking about startup capital, which is like the thing that we were able to hone in on in these surveys, because there is a sort of limited information on financing and access to finance. We use the World Bank enterprise surveys to look at, at the firm level. And so these are surveys that look at firms that have at least 5 employees. We also looked at 2 household surveys, the Indonesian Family Life Survey and the Vietnam Access to Resources Household Survey. Mostly I'll be focusing on those latter 2 in the brief results that I'll show today. So we find that startup capital for women-owned businesses is 5 times lower than for men-owned businesses. So women are likely to own lower cost business types. So like a business that you think would the type of business that would require lower startup costs, but the pattern does persist within the business. Next slide, please. So you can see here, we're looking at by the 2 countries, Indonesia and Vietnam, for food industry, food services, and agricultural businesses. And you can see that the distribution of the startup costs for men is definitely indicating that in general, men are operating businesses that have higher startup costs. Next slide, please. And so when we think about those startup costs, we can also look at the source of the capital that the women are accessing, and we can see that that source of capital also differs. So women are far less likely to be accessing formal credit to get those funds that they need to start their businesses. Next slide. And you can see that here we're showing in the Indonesia sample for male businesses. The green bar shows the startup capital that is taken from savings or from family is much higher than that for women, and also from bank or external source dwarfs that for women. Additionally, we find in Vietnam, you see the same pattern, that men are much more likely to have borrowed capital in order to start up a business in the agri-food sector. So this leaves us with some questions in this area. Of course, we don't know if it's that women are choosing to operate businesses with lower capital and therefore they don't need access to credit, or they're being sort of forced into that type of business because they can't access the capital that they need to start more productive businesses. So there's just very limited information, and this shows us that we need to collect better and more detailed information on access to finance, beyond the production node of the agri-food system, and particularly to look at it by gender. Next slide. So just to touch off of that, I've been involved in some other work that I think is illustrative to this point that looks at gender and finance in the midstream of the agricultural value chain, and that we've been doing similar desk work, looking at what we know, what we don't know, but not limited to Vietnam and Indonesia. So this specifically has focused on the agricultural midstream. And we, again, have used World Bank enterprise surveys to identify midstream firms within the universe of firms that are documented in the enterprise surveys. And we study access to finance in the agricultural sector in 7 African countries. We find that firms with female managers have fewer employees, lower sales, fewer bank accounts, and less access to loans and credit. So this limited information that we can access does show that women are having trouble accessing finance, within this sector. But there's still much more that we need to learn. Next slide. So just to speak to the methodological challenges, first, just identifying the businesses that we're interested in looking at, sorting firms by sector and by value chain node is extremely challenging in survey data. You get limited information. So even to know if the firm is involved in agriculture or not, it's like, say they're indicated as they work in transportation. It's hard to say, like what they're transporting, so it's hard to know how to classify them. At the same time, if someone's, doing sales, you're not necessarily sure if they're a trader or a farmer just selling their goods. So sometimes it can be very challenging and time consuming to effectively classify firms, which makes it difficult to understand the needs along the value chain. It's also very difficult to sample micro, small, medium, and large businesses consistently because of the different ways in which you may pick them up. Micro and small businesses are often informal, and they might not get picked up in these like World Bank enterprise surveys that require a larger number of employees. So we have to turn to something like the LSMS to try to use the household enterprise module to get at those firms, but that has its own challenges. So we don't necessarily know that we're getting a representative sample of those businesses, and different households may classify them differently. It's difficult to understand employment within those household businesses, and the list goes on. So like a lot more attention needs to be put on understanding how we can really classify employment and business ownership in this sector. Understanding women's roles is also challenging. I have some recent work in a number of different contexts using studying survey methodology that suggests that surveys are really prone to underestimating women's activities, that there's a lot of biases baked into the ways in which people answer surveys and sometimes the ways in which surveys are designed that can just lead us to underestimate women's activities relative to men. And so we may not have a full understanding of women's roles in these businesses, which that can have knock-on effects to understanding like what they need in terms of finance in order to grow their businesses. So if we can't understand women's employment, moving to understand their contributions to household businesses is also, has the same types of issues. And then finally, when we look at existing surveys, there's just very little information on finance. It has not been a focus of many of these surveys that look at business development. But now, as the world is changing and there's so much new technologies, so many new technologies that are coming out into the agricultural sector, especially using digital platforms and trying to connect farmers and midstream actors in new and innovative ways. And finance is a major component of that, not credit, but also just payments, payment histories, connecting buyers and sellers in all sorts of ways. So understanding much more about how people access finance, both traditionally and in evolving ways in our new digital world is a key component of what we need to do as we look forward to changing the way surveys are designed. And I believe that is my last slide. Nope, next step, sorry. So just to wrap up this project, next we'll be implementing impact evaluations of our finance projects in Vietnam and Indonesia over the next year. And we're also in this related work, we'll be developing surveys to study midstream finance directly in 2 countries. So in both cases, as we implement our surveys and study the impact of financing programs, we'll be paying special attention to gender and known biases to try and improve upon and learn what we can do to better answer these questions that where we found these gaps exist. So thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Kate, and thanks to all of our presenters today. I'd like to invite you to put your cameras back on as we move into the Q&A portion. And to the people watching the webinar, please remember you can add your questions in the chat and we can incorporate them into those that we pose to the presenters. So let's start with a question for Jessica. The question is, to understand the effects of program elements, some evaluations embed these into their set of treatments. So for example, treatments including or excluding different elements. What are the pros and cons of using that approach versus the causal mediation approach that you used?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that is a really valuable strategy. And I would argue that's probably the gold standard for evidence of the effects of different components because it actually can generate randomized variation in the salience of different program components. The challenge is that then you need a large experiment with a large sample. So it has cost and feasibility implications. And particularly if you have a program like this one that has 3, 4, 5 different important components, depending on how you categorize them, that would become a very large trial, or you would have to choose kind of only one component that perhaps has a primary interest to vary. Another potential risk with that type of design is that if the response by participants to the different program variations is relatively similar, you may not actually see large differences across the treatment arms. So I think given a complex project, a complex program, and limitations on the size of the trial, causal mediation is a valuable tool that allows you to try to unpack the effect of a whole range of components, even when you're not able to run a trial large enough to separately evaluate each one.
Great, thank you. And then for Emily, can you talk a little bit more? Can you explain more on how the hotspot analysis will be used by stakeholders? And are there other types of hotspots, for example, climate change or demographic pressure, that could simultaneously be assessed and used in these discussions?
Yes, thank you. Actually, if you, on the study area map, we had a hotspot analysis, and the way we identified our project area from 6 countries for the larger study was looking at deforestation hotspots. So it is a really common tool, and as part of the project that this is a small gender component or small gender project that we were putting together as co-funding for a larger project. So that larger project does look at some of these environmental hotspots. We are interested in zero deforestation commodities. So what we see with these oil palm mills is that they are using a lot of fuel wood and also have a lot of emissions. So there is an interest in modeling those things as well, and that's with University of Lancaster. So our project brings in the social hotspots and brings the gender dimension to it.
Great, thank you. And another one for Emily. How similar or dissimilar are social indicators compared to public sector created ones like those of UNEP versus private sector developed indicators? Are there some key differences that you could draw our attention to?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we began this process by trying to decide where to begin, and there is this large UNEP CTAC community that brought together this huge community of practice to develop these impact categories, subcategories, and the indicators that go with it. But they really were very vague on the measurements. So really, how do you go about measuring for that indicator? As I understand, that has been in review since 2019, and it should be published shortly. But it is a massive document, it's a massive undertaking, and in practice, nobody really uses it in its fullness, probably because a lot of the steps beyond having the categories have not been really explicit. So then we started looking also at what companies are willing to use, because we do want this to be a tool that's useful for the oil palm working group. And a lot of the impact categories and subcategories overlap a lot. We did get a lot more detail about how to actually measure. So looking at, really the big categories like occupational health and safety, and which kind of count data, what are we counting, what are we assessing. When it got to beyond the workplace practices, and more to some of the social and perception indicators, this is where it really differed. And again, we still found gaps and needed to pull in the pro-way to get at some of the gender indicators and perceptions of gender norms. So yes, long story short, the impact categories are very similar. At the subcategory level, they are still similar. When we get down to the indicator and the actual measurement level, we found the private sector standards to be more explicit, and then also using sustainability standards because they have to get audited on these. There was where we were able to pull out some actual measurements.
Okay, great, thank you. And for Kate, do data exist to study financing comparisons between men and women to know if the startup capital differences persist over time? And are there other methodological challenges in studying the use of financing over the life cycle of an enterprise?
Sorry, could you repeat the first part?
Yeah. So do data exist to study financing comparisons between men and women to know if the startup capital differences persist over time?
Well, not the overtime question, I guess, is difficult. I mean, when you're thinking about startup capital for a particular business, that would be like a one-time measure. But so in that sense, I guess overtime doesn't make a lot of sense. But we would need, if we're thinking just about following the same businesses or following the same people to see if they're like moving in and out of business ownership, like if you had a LSMS survey with a panel component, you could look at that, or you could just, take an LSMS survey, look at repeated cross sections for the small and medium businesses. And I think the enterprise surveys, are done with some amount of frequency. I'd have to check on how often. I don't recall off the top of my head. So, I mean, I think that the answer is like sort of, but again, it would have all the same caveats of like the work that I just showed. So it wouldn't be like ideal in terms of like if we want to actually track the financial history of a certain business and like how, whether they get access to credit to like expand their businesses and that sort of thing. I don't really think we have like a lot of good surveys like that. We've been working in another project on trying to like look at what data actually exists that like targets midstream businesses and things like that. And there's very, very little that specifically look at those types of enterprises, even, for ad hoc type projects. And I don't know of any off the top of my head that would be like a panel survey that could like look at how businesses, there might be some that are like impact evaluations that have befores and afters, but not necessarily in the agricultural sector, probably only in like urban SME environments.
Okay, good, thank you, thanks. And I had a correction pop up as well that indeed it was about the differences over time, not around the startup capital. So, but you caught that as well. Good. So, if thinking about across all of the four projects, or sorry, the three projects that we were hearing from today, I know you're at different stages in the analysis and in the field work and so on. So maybe it's difficult to assess already. But are there things that you would like to have done differently, or that you would think should be done differently, given what you know now and the place you're in and the research in relation to the methods that you used? That's open for anybody, or for all of you, actually.
I guess I'd like to speak to the idea of working at the midstream node. We've typically worked with producers, and when we work with companies, oftentimes we're working with contract farmers or farmers tied to these companies. It was really a challenge working at the at this processing node and getting the sample size because we were interfering in the workplace, and we had two options: either they're do it during working hours, or we find them after hours. And so we were trying to work while they were working, and then trying to find their partners for the pro-way portion of the survey. A lot of them were migrant workers. Their families were outside the districts, so we were having to call. So just really entering from that midstream node affected our ability to do the sampling the way that we're used to doing with farmers, where you enter communities and everybody is right there, and you can follow them to the field or wait till they get home. But it really was a challenge, and never have I felt like I was interrupting somebody's work and maybe detracting from their income for that day, as I have during this study. It was really a challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Emily. For Kate or Jessica, what about for you?
That's a well, so we're still haven't really put our impact evaluation into the field. So hopefully I haven't yet made any mistakes. I'm sure we will when we get to designing the survey. And like in working with the existing data, I wouldn't say, we've just been stuck with sort of what is there. In the work that we've been doing that's kind of related, that is actually like studying methods by doing experiments or variations in surveys in the field to try and get a better understanding of these things. I think it is actually very tricky to anticipate how you're going to end up analyzing the data, and like you make, I always wish I had constructed something a little bit differently prior to putting it in the field to be able to get at the exact question that we're looking at. I don't think that's like unique necessarily to this particular question, but just like, yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer. I feel like I do regret some things, but nothing great. And I feel like that this long interval of like having, especially focused on Vietnam, we haven't really been able to do a lot of field work, make progress because of travel restrictions. I expect that this long period we've been doing other things will make our data collection better, because we have thought about it so much more than we typically would have had spent time on doing it. So that's like one silver lining on a very dark cloud.
Great. Okay, thanks, Kate. Good. Jessica, do you want to respond to that one also?
Sure. I have a relatively simple reflection, which is for understanding how this type of complex programming, targeting value chain participation or targeting other outcomes unfolds. I think it can be useful to draw on a wider range of reports just about participation. We typically rely on household reports, did you attend a training or are you part of a group? But we find certainly in more informal discussions that partners who are implementers in the field often have a very different perception of the level of participation or the type of participation. And that, of course, can be very meaningful for an exercise like this, where we're using those reports about who did what to actually unpack the pathways for the intervention. So even simple strategies like having other monitoring systems to compile attendance reports or estimates of who's participating, what type of activity, seems low cost and would be a really useful addition to the type of information we usually have in our household surveys.
Okay, thank you. So a question has come in also for Kate from Martin van Ginkel. The question is, although women-run enterprises are smaller, is their relative return on investment maybe still higher than those run by men?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. That's a good thing that that's, a question that we'll hopefully be looking at. There is some like evidence, outside the agricultural sector that suggests that might be true, having looked at cash transfers, but it's quite like, it is mixed. I don't think that's an answer that's a question we really have an answer to. And I suspect it's context specific. But I think when we think about agriculture, these things are very understudied. When we, when we think about women doing work, and even men, businesses in this sector. So hopefully there's more, I think there's a lot more attention now to like the non-farm agricultural sector as like a driver for growth and women's empowerment in particular. And the extent to which that's true now is unclear to me, but I think there is a lot of opportunity there. So hopefully we can learn more.
Okay.
And I will just add, I want to echo what Emily was saying about working in the midstream. It is like very difficult to do research, like because with farmers, you can easily interview 1,000 or 2,000 farmers, but with like midstream businesses, I alluded to like sampling situation, but also just like getting enough businesses to be able to really understand what's going on can be very complicated, because to do, well, I'm a quantitative researcher. To do quantitative research, you need sample size. And so sometimes when you have big businesses, there's like not enough to understand these things. So it's just like another thing that makes it difficult.
Great, thanks. For Jessica, there's a question just come in also. In these types of impact evaluations, the results can indicate whether or not to scale up and how. But how far can those recommendations go, since large scaling up could have offsetting effects like on prices, which may not give the same impacts as in a pilot study? Could you respond to that one?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge, certainly for interventions that are trying to encourage production of a certain type of commodity. Of course, if that intervention was highly effective on a large scale, you could expect price effects. I don't think there's a perfect answer. You can certainly supplement the evaluation with other types of analysis using existing descriptive data, market analysis, qualitative analysis. In this case, for example, there was kind of an underlying theory based on previous research that the real constraint in this market was supply, that demand was high and sort of unfulfilled, so there was presumptively some space for expansion without price effects. Of course, that theory can't be applied infinitely. It depends a lot on the scale. Beyond that type of contextual analysis that might help you understand what potential spillover effects are, a number of organizations have kind of, I think, become increasingly skilled in continuing to embed research in larger scale up. So assuming that you don't go from a pilot in 120 villages to a nationwide program, then there's some intervening steps where there can be more rollout, more expansion, more research to understand not just what general equilibrium effects are via prices or markets, but also if the implementation of the program itself changes when it's at scale. And almost always the answer is yes, it does change in different ways. So that type of more gradual expansion or research path can be a valuable opportunity, if it's available given the broader context. In this case, the program is continuing and expanding, and we are also embedding some additional kind of more focused implementation research in the next phase. So hopefully that will be a good opportunity to learn more.
Great. Okay, thanks very much for your response. We have just a couple of minutes before I turn to Frank for his final reflections. Do you have any questions for each other about your colleagues' methods and how they've undertaken the research? No questions.
We've talked so much over the last year. It's been a pleasure to learn from all of you, and I look for. I wish we could have done this all in person. 2020 changed the dynamic, but it's been really great to learn across institutions the nature of everybody's work, and then hopefully we have the discussion at the end about how to do the cross learning. Because I remember Rhiannon and you at our first meeting had us say where we thought the synergies would be. It would be nice to revisit those and see if we can still find them.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, and I think, as you say, the path has been a very different one than we imagined at the outset, and far fewer moments to meet face to face and share experiences and ideas and look at the synergies. But yeah, I think some things have still come out, so that's that's also really good to see in terms of cross-project learning. Good. Well, with that, I will ask Frank to come back on and share some final
Okay.
reflections with it. That's all.
Okay, well, I have not too much more to say, but I also fondly remember the first meeting we had in Amsterdam when getting everyone together in on the same houseboat or something. I forget
Yeah.
what it was actually, but that was very nice, and I'm really glad that it did work out. We had a little bit of a rocky start in terms of making sure we had the right financing for everyone. So everybody got off to a bit later start than hoped for in 2020, and we had to make some adjustments. So I'm very grateful to the three here and the other three case study leaders for actually persisting and pursuing and getting the work done in a very short time frame. And I think, as I said in the opening remarks, I think the one CGI, we're really trying to explore how to transform food systems, water systems, land systems, and we're trying to create a number of initiatives that are trying to aim to have multiple impacts in different impact areas, including gender equality is a big one now for the CGIAR. And I think these studies, although small in resources, at least from our side, sometimes they fit into a larger one, as in Emily's and Jessica's cases. But I think they all really demonstrate how to try to bring together different research strands for trying to achieve multiple gains and outputs. So we have a lot that are looking at gender equality, but poverty at the same time, or jobs at the same time, or environment at the same time, or nutrition at the same time. And I think that's really kind of the way going forward. So I think these are all very useful studies and can help position the CGIAR for doing better and greater things in the future, more coherently and collectively across the system. So thanks to all, and thanks to Rhiannon for moderation as well.